The stables had not held a single horse in 4 years when the Duke of Ravensworth threw open their splintered doors in front of the entire wedding party and told Margaret Ashby that this and nothing more would be her portion. She stood in the straw-strewn dust with her hands folded in front of her, and though the smell of rot and neglect rose up around them both, she did not step back, and she did not lower her eyes. Behind her, Lady Prudence Ashby pressed a handkerchief to her lips, as though the very air offended her, and beside Lady Prudence her golden daughter Josephine let out a laugh, so bright and so cruel that 2 of the stable cats bolted from the rafters. "The old stables," the Duke said, and his voice carried flat and cold across the yard, "have stood empty since my father's finest horses died of the rot that no one troubled to prevent. The roof leaks, the stalls are rotten through. There is no groom, no feed, no coin set aside for either. It is yours, Miss Ashby, as full and final settlement of whatever claim you believe you hold upon this family." A murmur of delighted scandal moved through the assembled guests, because every soul standing in that yard understood precisely what they were witnessing. A ruined stable handed to a penniless, unwanted stepdaughter, announced in front of witnesses at her own stepsister's wedding breakfast, was not generosity. It was a public burial dressed up as a gift, and everyone present intended to remember every detail of it for years of gossip to come. Margaret curtsied low and correct, and said only, "Thank you, Your Grace," in a voice that did not waver, though something flickered tight and controlled behind her composed face. Josephine's laughter rang out again, sharper this time, and the Duke turned on his heel and walked back toward the wedding breakfast without a backward glance, leaving Margaret standing alone amid rotten timber and the ghosts of horses long dead. No one in that yard believed she would last the season. No one imagined that within 18 months the ruined stables of Ashby Hall would produce the finest bloodline of horses in all of England, that a duke's careless cruelty would become the making of a fortune, or that the very people laughing loudest that morning would one day beg for a place at her table. If you want to see exactly how far she climbed and exactly how far they fell, press that subscribe button now, because tonight's story is one you will not forget by the time it ends. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Now, let us go back to where this all truly began, 3 years before that rain of laughter fell upon her in the stable yard. Margaret Ashby had not always stood at the edge of rooms. She was permitted only to observe. She had been born the only daughter of Edmund Ashby, a gentleman known throughout the county for 2 things in equal measure: his devotion to horses and his devotion to his motherless child, whom he raised with an unusual conviction that a girl's mind deserved as much cultivation as a girl's needlework. He taught her, before she was 10 years old, how to read the conformation of a horse's leg for weakness. The stables had not held a single horse in 4 years when the Duke of Ravensworth threw open their splintered doors in front of the entire wedding party and told Margaret Ashby that this and nothing more would be her portion. She stood in the straw-strewn dust with her hands folded in front of her, and though the smell of rot and neglect rose up around them both, she did not step back, and she did not lower her eyes. Behind her, Lady Prudence Ashby pressed a handkerchief to her lips, as though the very air offended her, and beside Lady Prudence her golden daughter Josephine let out a laugh, so bright and so cruel that 2 of the stable cats bolted from the rafters. "The old stables," the Duke said, and his voice carried flat and cold across the yard, "have stood empty since my father's finest horses died of the rot that no one troubled to prevent. The roof leaks, the stalls are rotten through. There is no groom, no feed, no coin set aside for either. It is yours, Miss Ashby, as full and final settlement of whatever claim you believe you hold upon this family." A murmur of delighted scandal moved through the assembled guests, because every soul standing in that yard understood precisely what they were witnessing. A ruined stable handed to a penniless, unwanted stepdaughter, announced in front of witnesses at her own stepsister's wedding breakfast, was not generosity. It was a public burial dressed up as a gift, and everyone present intended to remember every detail of it for years of gossip to come. Margaret curtsied low and correct, and said only, "Thank you, Your Grace," in a voice that did not waver, though something flickered tight and controlled behind her composed face. Josephine's laughter rang out again, sharper this time, and the Duke turned on his heel and walked back toward the wedding breakfast without a backward glance, leaving Margaret standing alone amid rotten timber and the ghosts of horses long dead. No one in that yard believed she would last the season. No one imagined that within 18 months the ruined stables of Ashby Hall would produce the finest bloodline of horses in all of England, that a duke's careless cruelty would become the making of a fortune, or that the very people laughing loudest that morning would one day beg for a place at her table. If you want to see exactly how far she climbed and exactly how far they fell, press that subscribe button now, because tonight's story is one you will not forget by the time it ends. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Now, let us go back to where this all truly began, 3 years before that rain of laughter fell upon her in the stable yard. Margaret Ashby had not always stood at the edge of rooms. She was permitted only to observe. She had been born the only daughter of Edmund Ashby, a gentleman known throughout the county for 2 things in equal measure: his devotion to horses and his devotion to his motherless child, whom he raised with an unusual conviction that a girl's mind deserved as much cultivation as a girl's needlework. He taught her, before she was 10 years old, how to read the conformation of a horse's leg for weakness, how to judge temperament from the set of an ear and the flick of a tail, how to breed for endurance rather than merely for beauty, a distinction he insisted mattered more than any fashionable buyer in London. He married again when Margaret was 14, a widow named Lady Prudence, with a daughter of her own, and he did so, as such men so often do, out of loneliness rather than clear sight. Lady Prudence had smiled warmly through the courtship and shown her true character only once. The marriage lines were signed and sealed. When Edmund Ashby died unexpectedly of a chill 3 years later, Lady Prudence discovered to her fury that the estate's finances were considerably thinner than appearances had suggested, and she resolved, within a season of the funeral, that the simplest remedy for a difficult inheritance was to treat her stepdaughter as an unwelcome expense rather than a daughter to be provided for. Josephine, younger than Margaret by 2 years and her mother's clear favourite, absorbed this lesson with the eager cruelty of a child who has never once been denied anything she wanted. By the time Margaret turned 20, she had been quietly stripped of every privilege that had once been hers by right. She ate apart from company when guests came calling. She wore gowns cut down from Josephine's old wardrobe, always a season behind fashion, always pinned wrong at the waist. She managed the estate's remaining correspondence, kept its accounts, negotiated with its few remaining tenants, and received in exchange for all of it nothing but permission to remain beneath a roof that had once been her father's. She never argued. This unsettled Lady Prudence far more than any quarrel could have, because a woman accustomed to controlling every room she entered found herself, again and again, unable to provoke from her stepdaughter anything beyond a level gaze and a few composed words before Margaret. Servants at Ashby Hall would later say they had never once heard Miss Margaret raise her voice, not even when cruelty was delivered directly to her face, and that this stillness frightened Lady Prudence more than screaming ever would have. What no one troubled to notice, because no one thought her worth watching, was what Margaret did in the hours she was left alone. She was the one who walked 2 miles every week to bring oats and a little coin to old Tom Baxter, once her father's head groom, now retired and half-blind, living alone with nothing but memories of the horses he had once loved. She was the one who taught the kitchen boy his letters by the light of a banked fire long after the household had gone to sleep. She was the one the few remaining tenant farmers trusted to negotiate fairly, because her word, unlike her stepmother's, had never once proven false. It was this quiet, unwitnessed decency, built up in 1,000 small, unrewarded acts, that no one at Ashby Hall thought mattered in the slightest, and it would prove, before the story's end, to matter more than anything else in it. The humiliations once begun never repeated themselves in quite the same shape twice, as though Lady Prudence and Josephine kept a private accounting of Margaret's remaining pride and worked through it deliberately, one indignity at a time. The first true public wound came at the County Assembly held that autumn at Fenwick House, an event that drew every family of consequence for 20 miles, and determined by long custom whose daughters were considered worth courting that season. Margaret had not wished to attend, but Lady Prudence insisted, since an unmarried stepdaughter left conspicuously at home invited exactly the kind of curiosity she preferred to manage rather than ignore. Margaret wore a gown of faded green silk, once Josephine's, taken in carefully the night before by her own hand, the stitches so fine that only close scrutiny would have revealed the alteration. She had dressed her own hair, for want of a maid to spare. She looked, by any honest measure, graceful and composed. It made no difference. Josephine arrived in rose damask, trimmed with genuine pearls, a necklace that had once belonged to Margaret's own late mother, and had, through some accounting Margaret was never permitted to examine, found its way into Lady Prudence's jewel case instead of her own. Josephine glanced across the room at Margaret's gown and did not trouble to lower her voice when she remarked to the young lady beside her, "How strange! I recall giving that very dress to the poor box last winter. Someone must have rescued it from the rag heap." The laughter that followed was not universal, but it came from precisely the circle of guests whose good opinion mattered most, and it stung all the more for its precision. Margaret's face went very still, the way it always did, and she said only, "It fits me rather better now than it ever fit you, Josephine. I am glad it found a use." Then she turned to speak with the elderly Mrs. Fenwick about her prize hens, and passed the remainder of the evening in quiet conversation with the footman who came to refill the punch, learning, without asking, the name of one man's new grandchild and the trouble another was having with a lame knee. Sir Walter Fenwick himself, who noticed a great deal more at his own gatherings than his reputation for distraction, suggested watch this small exchange from across the room and said nothing that night, though he did not forget it, and its memory would matter considerably before the year was through. The second humiliation arrived at the harvest ball, held at Colworth Manor the following spring, and this time it was Margaret's age they chose to sharpen their cruelty against. Josephine, dancing her fourth set that evening with the same eligible young captain, observed within Margaret's hearing that it was rather touching how her stepsister still bothered attending such gatherings at all, given that most unmarried women past 20 were generally considered settled comfortably into spinsterhood, and that Margaret ought to be admired for her persistence rather than pitied for her prospects. The young captain laughed, uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict her. Margaret, standing near the refreshment table because no partner had thought to ask her, replied without any heat at all, "Persistence costs nothing, Josephine, and I find I can afford a great deal more of it than you can afford." Pearls. She excused herself moments later, to assist an elderly gentleman who had dropped his cane, kneeling to retrieve it herself rather than summoning a footman, and spent a quarter of an hour in conversation with him about the regiment his son had died serving in, a conversation no one else in that glittering hall thought worth the time. The third humiliation, and the cruelest of the pattern, came that Christmas, when Lady Prudence remarked to a circle of seated guests, well within Margaret's hearing, that her stepdaughter managed the estate's remaining accounts so very competently, precisely because she had so little else in life to occupy her attention or her hopes, the implication landing exactly where it was meant to land. Margaret's hands did not tremble as she poured the tea. She said only that she was grateful to be of use to a household that had given her so very much, and the bitter irony of the statement escaped everyone in that room except the housekeeper, who had served the family for 15 years and who caught Margaret's eye across the parlour with an expression of fierce, silent loyalty that meant more to Margaret than any of them would ever know. It was at this same Christmas gathering, though no one at Ashby Hall yet suspected it, that a stranger first arrived quietly in the county, travelling under the borrowed name of Mr. Bronzy, Fairfield, ostensibly to inspect a distant tenant farm, though his true purpose was rather more complicated and rather more personal than any farm could account for. The man calling himself Fairfield had not always been the guarded, unreadable figure the county would soon come to both fear and admire. 12 years earlier, for he had inherited the title of Duke of Ravensworth, he had loved a young woman named Cordelia Ray with the whole of an unguarded heart, a woman celebrated as the most beautiful in 3 counties and courted by every eligible man for 50 miles. He had proposed within the year. She had accepted him not for love, but for the fortune and title he did not yet hold, and when a wealthier match presented itself only weeks before the wedding, she had abandoned him without a single word of farewell beyond a hastily written letter, leaving behind a scandal that had taken years to quiet. The betrayal had not simply hurt him, it had remade him entirely. He had become, in the years since, a man who trusted no surface at all, who assumed charm concealed calculation and beauty concealed emptiness, who tested everyone he encountered without mercy because he had learned, at devastating cost, that appearance revealed nothing true about the character beneath it. He travelled the country under assumed names, precisely so that he might watch how people treated those who could offer them nothing in return, servants, the elderly, the poor, because he had come to believe this, and only this, was the one honest measure of a soul. He had come to this particular county because a distant relation held land nearby and had written of a family, the Ashbys, whose finances were rumoured to be considerably more precarious than their public bearing suggested, precisely the kind of disguised rot he had learned to recognise and expected. What he found instead at that Christmas gathering, standing at the edge of a crowded room in a gown clearly taken in from someone else's wardrobe, was a young woman with an extraordinarily still face, who had just been publicly diminished by her own family, crossed the room without hesitation to help an old man she owed nothing to and gained nothing from. He watched her for the better part of an hour, without once approaching, and what he witnessed unsettled 10 years of hard-won suspicion in a way nothing had managed since Cordelia Ray's farewell letter. Margaret sought out no one of consequence that evening. She spent long minutes drawing a shy young curate into conversation about his parish work, until his stammer disappeared entirely. She noticed a maid nearly stumble beneath a heavy tray near the punch bowl and rose at once to steady it before anyone else had even registered the near accident, thanking the girl by a name he was quite certain none of the grander guests in that room could have supplied. She did all of this with no apparent awareness that she was being watched at all, which was, in his hard experience, the single most reliable evidence that a person's kindness was genuine, rather than performed for an audience. He did not introduce himself that night. 10 years of caution were not undone in a single evening, however striking, but he left with her name lodged somewhere. He could not easily dislodge it, and in the weeks that followed, he found himself making quiet inquiries about the Ashby family that had little to do with the tenant farm that had supposedly brought him to the county at all. What those inquiries revealed troubled him, though not in the direction he had first expected. He learned that what few tenants remained on Ashby land trusted Margaret's word absolutely, and Lady Prudence's not at all. He learned that Margaret had, the previous winter, personally arranged for old Tom Baxter's cottage roof to be mended after a storm, paying for it from some source Lady Prudence could never quite trace in the household accounts. He learned through a discreet solicitor permitted a glance at the estate's ledgers under the pretense of a possible loan that money moved through those accounts in directions that traced back not to extravagance but to a long, patient pattern of quiet charity funded consistently, it seemed, at Margaret's own considerable personal cost. He also learned, in that same set of careful inquiries, precisely how deep the Ashby family's true financial trouble truly ran, and it was here that his attention began to shift decisively toward a different target altogether. It began, as these things so often do, with a conversation never meant to be overheard. The man calling himself Fairfield had taken rooms at the coaching inn nearest Ashby Hall, and it was there one evening that he found himself unable to avoid the low, oily voice of Mr. Selwyn, Lady Prudence's solicitor, speaking through the thin wall to a gentleman named Mr. Harding, a corn merchant of considerable new wealth and considerably less scruple, whose courtship of Josephine had far more to do with the Ashby name than with any genuine affection. Selwyn's voice explained, with the particular smoothness of a man well practiced in the art, that the Ashby estate stood nearly bankrupt, that Lady Prudence had borrowed for years against land she did not fully control to preserve an appearance of prosperity necessary to secure Josephine a fine match. Harding provided would be swallowed almost entirely by debts already owed, rather than serve as any true dowry at all. Mr. Harding, to his limited credit, sounded troubled. Mr. Harding. Selwyn reassured him that none of it need come to light, provided the wedding proceeded swiftly, and that Miss Margaret, who alone kept the household's true accounts and therefore posed the only genuine risk of discovery, could be managed easily enough, since she had nowhere else to go and no name of her own to protect, and would say nothing rather than risk being cast out with even less than she already possessed. The man in the next room stood very still for a long moment after the voices fell silent, turning the pieces over in his mind. It confirmed something he had begun to suspect and had been reluctant to believe too quickly, that the young woman who had knelt without hesitation to steady a stumbling maid, who mended an old groom's roof in secret and taught a kitchen boy his letters by firelight, who kept the true and honest accounts of a household built entirely on borrowed appearances, was not decent by accident. She was quite possibly the only honest soul in that entire family, and she was being deliberately sidelined and silenced, precisely because her honesty threatened everyone around her. He did not act that night. A decade of caution had taught him that conclusions reached in haste were rarely conclusions worth trusting. But from that evening forward, he began watching the Ashby family with considerably sharper attention, and he began watching Margaret Ashby most closely of all, no longer merely as an object of curiosity, but as a woman whose treatment at her own family's hands had begun, quite against his will, to matter to him a very great deal. It was some months later, in the depths of a hard winter, that Lady Prudence's carefully maintained appearance of prosperity finally began to crack in earnest, and it was Margaret, inevitably, chosen to bear the weight of its collapse. A creditor travelled up from London, a man of considerable standing and even less patience, demanding immediate settlement of a note that had gone unpaid for the better part of a year, one Lady Prudence had evidently believed could be endlessly renegotiated. When it became plain that no further delay would be tolerated, Lady Prudence did not do what an honest woman might have, which was to acknowledge the debt and seek a fair remedy. Instead, in a fit of panic dressed up as decisiveness, she announced to the creditor and to the assembled household, with Margaret standing directly before her, that the ruinous mismanagement responsible for this debt lay entirely with her stepdaughter, who had, she claimed, been given far too much authority over the household's finances and had proven herself unequal to the trust. It was, everyone present understood, a lie invented on the spot, and a particularly cruel one, given that Margaret had spent years quietly propping up an estate whose true ruin had been set in motion long before any ledger was ever placed in her hands. But Margaret did not argue. She stood in the cold hall of the only home she had ever known and listened to her stepmother assign her the blame for a catastrophe she had labored for years without thanks to prevent, and she said nothing at all in her own defense. She asked only whether the creditor required anything further, and when he did not, she excused herself and returned that same evening to the small room where she conducted the estate's remaining business, drafting letters that might yet buy the family another month's grace. This scene, reported within the day by the innkeeper's wife, who traded gossip to Mr. Fairfield for the generous coin he never failed to leave behind, was what finally moved the watching Duke to act, though not in any manner the household at Ashby Hall could have anticipated. He did not reveal his identity. He did not intervene directly, which would have been, he understood, a kind of rescue that robbed Margaret of the very thing she had proven, again and again, entirely capable of managing herself. Instead, he did something considerably stranger and considerably more calculated, something the county would speak of for years afterward as either the cruelest jest ever played upon a defenseless young woman, or the shrewdest kindness ever disguised as one. He owned among his scattered holdings a set of stables at what had once been a fine estate 2 counties over, stables that had stood empty for 4 years since disease had swept through the family's finest bloodline, and no one had troubled to restore them since. They were, by any reasonable measure, worthless, a burden rather than an asset. Precisely the kind of ruin a landlord kept, only because tearing it down cost more than ignoring it. He arranged, through his solicitor and through careful conversation with Lady Prudence, that made deliberate use of her panic and her eagerness to be rid of any obligation to her stepdaughter for those very stables to be offered to Margaret as full settlement of whatever claim she might one day raise against the Ashby estate, a claim she had never made and never would have made, but one Lady Prudence was only too relieved to extinguish cheaply and publicly. Word reached Lady Prudence's ears, exactly as intended, that this was a generous gesture from a wealthy stranger, a chance for the girl to have something of her own, however modest. He did not mention that he had personally inspected those stables the previous autumn, and found their stonework, despite the collapsed roof and rotten stalls, entirely sound, built by craftsmen who understood their trade. He did not mention that the paddocks surrounding them, unused for 4 long years, had rested long enough to grow some of the richest grazing land in the county, precisely suited to the patient, careful breeding that Margaret Ashby had spent her whole life quietly learning at her father's side. He explained to no one that what looked to the world like a punishment handed down by an indifferent aristocrat was, in truth, the most important test he had devised in a decade of testing, because he had begun, against every instinct of betrayal had trained into him, to hope with his whole guarded heart that she would pass it. And so it was that at Josephine's own wedding breakfast, in front of the assembled county, the Duke of Ravensworth handed Margaret Ashby the deed to a set of ruined stables called it her inheritance settled in full, and walked away without a backward glance, leaving her standing amid rotten dust while her stepsister's laughter rang out behind her, and leaving every soul present convinced they had just witnessed the final humiliating chapter of a story that could only end in her ruin. They could not have been more wrong. Margaret walked the 6 miles to the stables that very afternoon, alone, since no coach was offered and no company volunteered. She stood a long while outside the sagging doors before stepping through them, taking in the collapsed section of roof, the rotten stall partitions, the silence where hooves and whinnies should have rung out, and something in her chest, long trained by 3 years of cruelty to feel very little, allowed itself to register the full weight of how entirely alone she was. Then she stepped inside, and by the time the light failed that evening, she had already begun a list by the stub of a single candle of everything that needed doing first. She had, as it turned out, more resources than the world credited her with, chief among them a mind steeped since childhood in everything her father had known about horses and land and patient husbandry. She had old Tom Baxter, whom she had fed and visited faithfully for 3 years without ever once expecting repayment, and who arrived at the stables within 2 days, half-blind but sharp of memory, declaring that he had trained finer grooms than any in the county and would not sit idle while a debt of kindness went unpaid. She had the kitchen boy she had taught to read, now nearly grown and strong enough for real labor, who walked the 6 miles every single day without wages to help clear the yard and mend fences. She had the handful of tenant farmers who remembered exactly whose word could be trusted in that county, and who began, quietly and without fanfare, to appear with tools, with feed, with whatever spare coin they could offer toward a single sound broodmare to begin the work properly. None of this was witnessed by the wider county, who assumed precisely as intended that Margaret Ashby was living out a slow and dignified ruin in a rotten stable 2 counties from home. Josephine told anyone who would listen that her stepsister had finally received exactly what her lack of prospects deserved. Lady Prudence, relieved of an obligation she had never wanted, spoke of Margaret rarely and always, with a performance of regret so thin that no one who knew her well was fooled by it in the least. What the county did not see, because no one thought to look, was a roof rebuilt beam by beam through a punishing winter, stalls rebuilt sound and dry by hands that had learned patience from years of enduring what could not be argued with, and a single mare purchased with money, bred with a shrewdness that came from a girl who had spent her whole life quietly studying the difference between a horse that merely looked fine and a horse that truly was. By the following spring that first foal stood in the paddock at what had once been a ruin, and, word of its extraordinary conformation, its speed, its uncanny calm temperament, began to travel along the roads in the particular way such things always do. The man, calling himself Fairfield, still moving quietly through the county, made a point of riding past those stables at a discreet distance perhaps once a month, and what he witnessed on each occasion did more to dismantle a decade of careful suspicion than any single conversation could have managed. He saw paddocks once bare, now green and well managed, fences mended, a foal in the yard that even his own experienced eye recognized as exceptional. He saw, on one occasion, Margaret herself, standing in the yard with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, running a steady, knowing hand down a yearling's foreleg, with the calm, unhesitating authority of someone who had known exactly what she was doing all along. He began, in those quiet months of watching from a distance, to understand that what he had handed her as punishment she had received as opportunity, and that the ruin he had intended as her final test had instead become the first place in her life where her competence and her patient strength of character were permitted to operate entirely unwatched, without her stepmother's interference or her stepsister's cruelty standing in the way. He began to understand something considerably more uncomfortable about himself, which was that the guarded distance he had maintained for 10 years, the careful observation that asked nothing of him but judgment, had become, somewhere in those quiet rides past a rebuilt stable, something a great deal warmer and a great deal more dangerous to the armor he had built around his own heart. He was not, however, the only person in that county whose attention had turned toward those stables as the year wore on, and the attention of the others was considerably less generous. Mr. Selwyn had continued, in the months since, managing Lady Prudence's mounting debts with the same blend of flattery and quiet manipulation that had served him well for years, and it was he who brought word to Lady Prudence that following autumn that the ruined stables were, in point of fact, no longer ruined at all, that they had produced, by all report, a foal of remarkable quality, already drawing offers from breeders as far as London, and that Mr. Poor Harding, whose courtship of Josephine had cooled considerably as rumours of the family's true finances spread, had been overheard remarking with some admiration on the industry of the young woman 2 counties over, a comparison Lady Prudence found intolerable the instant she grasped its meaning. Josephine received this news with a fury that surprised even her mother, for it had become plain, through gossip she could no longer control, that Mr. Harding's growing admiration for Margaret's evident skill was beginning to look in the eyes of the county a great deal more attractive than Josephine's pearls and imported damask, particularly now that whispers of the family's debts had spread well beyond the walls of any coaching inn. It was in this atmosphere of mounting panic and wounded vanity that Lady Prudence, Josephine, and Mr. Selwyn began scheming in earnest, meeting in the evenings in the same small parlour that had once been Margaret's only sanctuary, their voices low but not quite low enough, because the housekeeper, whose devotion to Margaret had only deepened since her departure, and carried word of every plan straight to Margaret, with a loyalty that asked nothing in return. The plan they settled upon was this: Lady Prudence would announce publicly, at the first suitable opportunity, that the stables and the land surrounding them had never truly belonged to Margaret at all, that the settlement offered by the mysterious Mr. Billier Fairfield had been merely temporary pending finalization of the family's inheritance, and that any profit from Margaret's labour there rightfully belonged to the Ashby estate, since the property remained, in the strictest legal reading, entangled with the family's holdings still. It was a fragile and dishonest argument, built upon documents Mr. Rier Selwyn intended to forge and present with his usual oily confidence, but calculated to succeed, precisely because it would be delivered in public, before witnesses, at a moment when Margaret would have no opportunity to summon her own counsel, and no standing in the county's eyes to challenge so bold a claim. They chose the county's grand spring assembly at Fenwick House for the moment to spring this scheme, the very same hall where, more than a year before, Josephine had first mocked Margaret's borrowed gown in front of a room full of witnesses. It seemed to Lady Prudence a fitting symmetry to humble her stepdaughter a second time in the same room, and to do it now with the added satisfaction of stripping away whatever small success the girl had managed to wring from a ruined stable. None of them suspected, because none of them had troubled to look closely enough at the quiet Mr. Fairfield, who had been seen dining occasionally at Sir Walter Fenwick's table over the preceding months, that the man they assumed a gentleman of modest means was in fact the Duke of Ravensworth himself, and that he had spent the better part of a year assembling, through patient inquiry, a full accounting of every debt Lady Prudence owed, every forged document Mr. Selwyn had ever produced, and every particular of the scheme now whispered in a small parlour at Ashby Hall, because the housekeeper's reports had reached Margaret, and Margaret, in a decision that would come to define the whole remaining course of her life, through that same loyal housekeeper, a full account of the plot to the one man in the county she had come, over the preceding months to trust with her whole cautious heart. The spring assembly at Fenwick House that year drew a larger crowd than any within living memory, in part because word had spread, in the vague and distorted way that gossip always spreads, that something of significance concerning the Ashby family was expected. Though no one outside the small circle of conspirators understood precisely what shape that significance would take. Margaret arrived later than most, and when she did, a hush moved through the room, though it carried nothing of the old humiliation this time. She wore no borrowed gown, no cut-down silk let out at the seams. She wore a gown of her own choosing, simply cut but beautifully finished, purchased with money she had earned herself from the sale of a single, extraordinary colt whose reputation had already begun to travel the length of the country. And she entered that crowded hall with the same still, composed bearing she had always carried, save that now, for the first time in years, nothing in her posture suggested she expected to be diminished by anyone in that room. Lady Prudence waited until the dancing paused, and a natural lull settled over the crowd, precisely the moment she and Mr. Bowles. Selwyn had rehearsed for its effect, and rose, drawing every eye with the particular skill of a woman who had spent a lifetime commanding rooms she had no true right to command. She announced, in a voice pitched to carry, that a grave misunderstanding required correcting before the evening proceeded, concerning certain property, presently, and she implied, mistakenly held by her stepdaughter, property that remained in fact legally bound to the Ashby estate. Selwyn stepped forward with a folded document, prepared to offer it as proof, and Josephine positioned herself at her mother's side with an expression of practiced sympathy meant entirely for the crowd's benefit, the same expression she had worn a year earlier. It was at this precise moment, timed with the deliberateness the county would discuss for years afterward, that the doors of Fenwick House opened to admit a modest coach's single occupant, a man the assembled guests had known for months only as the quiet Mr. Dear Fairfield, and who now, stepping into the candlelight with an unhurried authority that silenced every whisper in the room at once, was introduced by Sir Walter Fenwick himself, in a voice shaking slightly with the weight of what he announced as His Grace Julian Ashworth Grey, the Duke of Ravensworth. The room did not merely gasp, it froze entirely, in the way a crowd freezes when it understands all at once that everything it believed about the preceding months has been quietly, thoroughly wrong. Josephine's hand, halfway extended toward her mother's arm, stopped in mid-air. Mr. Selwyn's folded document trembled visibly in his grip. A footman near the refreshment table, caught mid-pour, simply stopped, the wine overflowing unnoticed onto white linen, and no one in that transfixed room so much as glanced at the spreading stain. The Duke did not raise his voice. He had no need to. He crossed the room with the same unhurried authority with which he had entered it, addressing Lady Prudence directly, informing her that he was, in fact, entirely familiar with the property in question, having granted it himself, full and permanent settlement, to Miss Margaret Ashby. Documentation he had, with the foresight of long and bitter experience, brought with him this very evening in anticipation of exactly this dispute. He then turned to Mr. Tasker, Selwyn, and the warmth drained entirely from his voice, informing the solicitor that he was additionally in possession of a complete accounting of certain financial arrangements conducted on Lady Prudence's behalf over the preceding years, the forging of at least 2 documents currently held by creditors in London, who would, he assured the stunned assembly, be very interested indeed to learn the true state of affairs at Ashby Hall and the true authorship of the paperwork they had relied upon. The silence that followed was total. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a young lady's fan clattered to the floor, and no one so much as turned to look, so thoroughly did every eye remain fixed upon the small tableau at the centre of the room. The Duke of Ravensworth, unmasked at last, standing beside a young woman in a simple gown, whom every soul present now understood, with a shock that rearranged the entire preceding year, had never been ruined at all. The pronouncement that followed carried the cold precision of a magistrate rather than the warmth of a suitor, for the Duke understood, even in a moment that meant a very great deal to him, that justice required its own weight before it could make room for anything softer. He informed the assembled guests that any further attempt by Lady Prudence or Mr. Selwyn to lay claim to property lawfully belonging to Miss Margaret Ashby would be met with immediate and full disclosure of every fraudulent document in his possession, disclosure that would see Mr. Selwyn stripped of his license and very possibly facing charges, and that would see Lady Prudence's remaining creditors descend upon Ashby Hall with none of the patience they had thus far extended. Mr. Selwyn did not wait to learn whether the Duke intended to elaborate further. He was gone from Fenwick House before the hour was out, gone from the county entirely within the week, his practice quietly dissolved, and his reputation destroyed by whispers that spread faster and more thoroughly than any of his care.